I'm welcoming you on behalf of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, which is my own institution, as well as the African Development Bank. Tony Nyong, who is originally co-organizing this session, isn't here with us today. We've got two fantastic colleagues that have been preparing the session together with me over the course of this week. And we've got a fantastic panel lined up for you with a couple of presentations and then actually a couple of panelists that will be joining you in the discussion this morning. Because we hope to make particularly the second part of this event quite interactive, answering your questions and also confronting you with some statements in terms of this question of how to assess risk in a changing climate, and actually very much also how to address risk in a changing climate. One of the themes that seems to be running through a lot of the sessions that we've had here the past 2 days is particularly important also for climate risk, and that is how to do risk assessments that actually inform decision making and lead to better decisions. A lot of risk assessments are beautiful from a scientific perspective but stay on the shelf. And how do we connect risk assessments to addressing risk? That's going to be one of the themes running through this session here today as well, and we want to hear about your experiences. But let me briefly introduce the people that we've lined up for you, that got lined up for you, so that I don't have to go, I won't go through CVs as I introduce them now, but even keep it more informal as we go. For those of you in the audience addressing questions or answering some of the questions that we'll pose to you, please introduce yourself as you start speaking so that we have a sense where you're coming from. So the speakers we've got is first Balgis from the African Development Bank, who will be presenting on the IPCC special report on extremes. Balgis has a long history. Those on the climate change side know that she's one of the eminent experts in Africa on climate change adaptation. She's worked on this IPCC report together with me and a whole range of other lead authors for the past 3 years. She's one of the foremost experts in Africa able to tell you about this report. We're very honored to have her here. She's also with the African Development Bank, so putting some of the recommendations of the report in practice. And I think that's an even more interesting perspective that she also brings to the table today. Alexis is also with the African Development Bank and is going to tell us about the climate safeguard system that they've put in place and the questions that poses for risk assessment. I'm very honored to have Sophia Bettencourt with us today, who's been working in this field for 15, 20 years, already bridging climate and disaster risk management before climate adaptation was even an area of work in the international negotiations. First in the Pacific, where she already extracted some of the key messages that I think are still relevant today. In recent years, she's been working in Africa, including on the pilot program for climate resilience. And it's going to be very interesting to hear from us to which extent the observations from the Pacific have carried over to Africa, what sort of progress we're making in the past couple of years, and where the biggest wins are for the coming years. Particularly also reflecting back on that question of what role risk assessments play in actually making a difference on the ground. After those three presentations, we'll take it into a panel discussion. We've got 4 statements for you that we'll confront you with and ask you to come up with some opinions. And of course, these things are never black and white, but we'll stimulate some discussion by really asking your opinions and then questioning you on your choices. But we'll also have some experts to comment on those statements as well. Abdi Shakur from ICPAC, the East Africa Regional Climate Institution. Mark New, the Pro-Vice Chancellor of University of Cape Town, but also University of Oxford Professor of Climate Science. One of those people that really know the science inside out, but is also trying to do the bridging to the applications. James Kisia, very much on the practice side, coming from Kenya Red Cross. He's actually running the community risk session right after this one. And he's facing these questions of what this information means in the real life for real people on the ground, day to day. And finally, Youssef Aichelous, the Deputy Coordinator for the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction in Africa. And also, for many years already, in different capacities, in different organizations, one of the champions for better climate and disaster risk management, particularly also in Africa. So I think this is a very exciting lineup. I'll just get started quickly so that we use our time well. Very importantly, at the end, I mentioned you, because we want to keep this interactive. The way we'll do it is that we'll have these 3 presentations with quick, relatively technical Q&A blocks right after those presentations. I'll manage that quite strictly, so no deep policy discussions just at that stage, because we'll get to that later in the session. And then about halfway the session, we'll switch to a panel discussion mode. So let me briefly introduce the SREX. And as I said, Belgis is going to be talking in more detail, specifically about what the report says about Africa, just to give you a sense of how it connects to the real practice. For those of you not quite familiar with the international climate change architecture and policy making, the IPCC was established already in the late 80s to inform international policy on climate. Everyone already realized at that point that these were going to be difficult negotiations. They didn't quite know how difficult and how big these negotiations were going to get at the time. But they realized that one of the only ways to do proper climate negotiations was to have a solid scientific basis that would be sort of beyond negotiations in the real climate negotiations in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was established in the early 90s. So they decided to set up an independent science panel, but with some sort of a governmental connection. So this is a governmental panel, but the actual work is done by scientists. And every 7 years or so, they issue 3 big volumes, one on climate science, one on the impacts and adaptation, and one on the greenhouse gas reduction issues related to climate change. And essentially the best scientists in the world work together on these reports. It gets reviewed by everyone who wants to, by all the experts, and several of you contributing to these reports, but also being expert reviewers. So for this report, I think we got 20,000 expert comments that were taken into account through 3 review rounds before entering into the final chapters. Once those 3 review rounds are done, and that's experts and governments, the reports get frozen, but there's a summary for policymakers that's being negotiated with governments. So all the governments come together in a big plenary negotiation session, and the science there is no longer up for negotiation, but the way the science is presented is. So there is a summary for policymakers that's presented by the scientific author team, and they essentially present the conclusions as best as they think they are phrased in that summary for policymakers. But governments may then question, are you really presenting this in a fair way? There are things that in my country would be interpreted differently if you use these words, but actually based on the science in your chapters, we think it needs to be framed differently. It was a 1-week negotiation session in this case of this report. And then you end up with a summary that's actually approved by consensus by all world governments. So you end up with a combination of the very best science summarized in a summary for policymakers that is now approved governmental basis for negotiations and basis for policy and practice at national level. So it's a cumbersome process, but also a very exciting process in the sense that you really end up with something that is government approved worldwide. The IPCC had always, as I said before, done these reports in 3 volumes, and the last one of those came out in 2007. Everyone appreciated that report. There were a few mistakes, as you all know, that in a several thousand-page volume one might almost expect, but of course have big political ramifications in this sense. None of those actually affected the final conclusions, which were along the lines that you may all be familiar with, that we're fairly certain that climate change is already happening and that it will continue regardless of how we reduce the emissions in the near term, that we're in bigger trouble in the longer term if we don't reduce emissions further. But that we're already really facing problems in the short term as well. But there was one big gap that everyone realized. Over the past 10 years, the attention for the extreme side of climate change had been increasing tremendously. So instead of just being worried about average changes in temperature and precipitation in 2100 towards the end of the century, which were very important questions initially to get a handle of how big this whole problem of climate change was from a global perspective and whether we would need to start indeed reducing these greenhouse gases. The question was now really transitioning to a question of, is this one flood that's happening now that seems so unusual to me caused by climate change? And should we be anticipating different disasters in light of climate change? And climate science over the past 10 years has already gotten a lot further addressing some of these questions as well. More of the data analysis is aimed at extremes. More of the modeling is trying to look at smaller scales and at more extreme events and at different characteristics of climate variables. And a lot more of the adaptation science, the questions of how do we adapt to a changing climate, has been aimed at that dealing with the management of extremes rather than just at these gradually changing averages. So there's a lot of knowledge there that the IPCC didn't quite capture in the 2007 report because that knowledge was advancing so fast. At the same time, in the global community, there was a growing recognition that the disaster risk management community actually had a lot of lessons to offer for the climate change adaptation policy and international negotiations and frameworks, as well as local practice. So what the IPCC did, and the governments commissioned the special interim report on this topic because they realized they didn't want to wait 7 years for that knowledge to be brought to bear to both of these communities, the disaster community and the climate community. The governments requested the IPCC to do a special interim report with the regular procedure, so going through all these regular approval steps, on, well, in shorthand we usually call it the special report on extremes, but very importantly it's called the special report on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation. And this is quite significant for the IPCC as well, because traditionally the IPCC has worked in a very segmented way, where you've got the climate scientists working on one big volume, you've got the people working on impacts and adaptation on yet another big volume, and you've got the people working on climate change mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gases, working on yet a third volume. This piece was done by those first two communities together. So for the very first time, the questions asked of the climate scientists were actually phrased and framed from the perspective of those actually managing those risks. So this was an innovation for the IPCC, which I think we'll see filtering through into the big next assessment cycle as well. As I said, the report was approved by all governments last November in Kampala and released in full in April of this year. And again, importantly for the IPCC, usually the way the IPCC would look at this would be quite linear, and this is something that's highly unfamiliar to the disaster risk management community, but this was a major step for the IPCC to recognize that the weather and climate events are not the linear starting point. You go from hazards to impacts to managing those impacts, and then maybe you have, if you really advance, you've got some sort of monitoring and evaluation feedback loop or so. In this case, they recognized, and that was a very important discussion. It took us about the first half year of working with this new community of people working together, that disaster risk is actually defined partly, of course, by these events, and the fact that these events are changing has an impact on disaster risk, but that exposure and vulnerability are actually as important, and in terms of managing the risks, probably more important than just this in isolation. So one of the major overall conclusions is, of course, that a changing climate does lead to changes in extreme weather and climate events. And this report provides the state of the art from region to region, sub-region to sub-region, of what we can expect in terms of changing extremes. And for some extremes, that's very obvious and very certain, like for changing risk of hot days and heat waves. For some extremes, and particularly for some extremes in certain regions, certain places, the report is also very outspoken that we actually don't know. There's quite a lot of places where we're actually just facing rising uncertainty, which poses additional challenges, for instance, for early warning. If we don't know exactly which disasters to anticipate in the coming 20 years, how do we set up our disaster risk management strategies? So even that sense of uncertainty is, in a way, an important piece of information that you can get out of this report. We won't take you through all of those scientific details. We'll get you the links to the full report information, as well as some regional summaries that have been prepared at the end of this presentation. Now, very importantly, the report was also asked by governments, because their concern, and part of the reason why they requested this report in the first place from the IPCC was, of course, the rising losses that we've heard so much about these days as well. And the main conclusion of the report is actually that it's impossible at this point to attribute the rising trend of disaster losses to climate change. So climate change may already play a role in some of it. There are trends in some observed climate variables, but the dominant reason for the rise in losses is the increasing exposure. And I think that's a very important realization for the climate community, because it also provides a handle on where the management interventions are that allow you to reduce risk even as these hazards are growing. This is the area where we've got a lot of work to do and a lot of space for improvement. The report also concludes quite strongly that it's not an either-or. It's not suddenly a whole sea change of the way we do risk management in light of climate change. We're going to be adopting the same range of solutions that we've always employed. There's going to be a role for disaster response, as we've always seen it, and we might need to do more of it in a changing climate. But overall, there's going to be a role for risk transfer, for instance, which we'll need and might need more of. But overall, the general balance of things needs to shift more towards anticipation and resilience, in light of the fact that we're dealing with increasing risks and we're dealing with changing risks that are going to be more difficult to anticipate if we just reduce risks based on historical experience. I mentioned that there's a lot of scientific information. I won't take you through this graph. It's an impossible graph, actually. It wasn't a summary for policymakers. Many governments already in that negotiation session complained that this was something they could impossibly take to their ministers. And actually, it even takes quite a lot of time to explain to a lot of climate scientists. The information is there. It's highly valuable if you dive deep into it. For technical people, I think it's great stuff. It also underlines, I think, one of the themes that we should be discussing here today, that making the bridge from this sort of climate science to the real applications requires a couple of steps in between. And once again, I'm very honored to have Balgis now continuing this presentation on this important report, particularly from an African perspective, and highlighting some of the conclusions from the report in the context of the continent that we're in today. So Balgis, please, the floor is yours. Do you want to use the walking microphone or this one?
Yeah, I can use this.
Okay, thanks.
Good morning. It's not working. Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Martin, for your introduction. I have 12 minutes, so I will be fast. And as Martin mentioned, I will focus on Africa. The special report with focus on African context. My talk will cover briefly the exposure of Africa to climate change and extremes, and the key messages related to risk management and adaptation. This has already been mentioned by Martin. Also this one, that the impact is not necessarily due to extreme. It can other factors like vulnerability, which is the degree to which a system and the people are exposed to climate events, including variability and extremes, and the exposure, which is also the presence of people, the presence of acids, cultural heritage, and everything, services in places which are more susceptible to adverse effects of climate. Africa is exposed to all different types of extremes, including drought, floods, heat waves, tropical cyclones, and historically Africa has known many cycles of drought, which is not a new thing, but now the fact that there is an increase in the frequency in terms of frequency, magnitude, and spatial coverage, and of course the increased exposure leading to more losses. Now we can talk about millions and billions sometimes of losses due to drought. Floods generally is beneficial, but with increasing also exposure and the poor infrastructure in many parts of Africa, it can have a very devastating effect. The heat wave in a continent which is mostly very hot, any increase in temperature would definitely lead to human health and agricultural problems, and especially in urban areas. Tropical cyclones in many parts, particularly places like Madagascar and Mozambique, and the projected sea level rise is expected to compound the impacts of the tropical cyclones. In terms of increasing frequency and intensity of climate extremes, this has already been observed, because every day we receive news about a disaster somewhere, and terminologies like the deadliest, the hottest are being used more and more now. So it is more extreme and more impacts. Sometimes we have like thousands of deaths, millions of migration, large percent of properties lost. And the report has very well documented these observations. Related to Africa, it gave information across the region and sub-regions in terms of the trends in temperature, the minimum, the maximum, the heat wave, the precipitation, and drought. And the upward arrow about increasing trends, and then the down one is the decreasing, and the color is the degree of confidence in the findings. So the darker the color, the more confidence in the finding. And we can see there are, the trend is generally increasing, but the projected ones give more confidence, more trends towards increasing in terms of temperature, heat waves, and precipitation in the different parts of Africa. In terms of losses, we know that in economic losses generally are higher in developed countries, but if we consider the rate of fatality, the proportion of the portion of GDP, it is more in developing countries. And related to Africa, it's mostly due to drought, and economic losses due to drought are most of the time are underreported, and there is no real measurement of losses in terms of economic ecosystem services, cultural heritage, and even human lives. That's why you can see Africa accounted for less than 1% of the global economic losses related to disasters. As Martin mentioned, the risk factors is not only the climate extremes. The many underlying factors that exist could increase the exposure and could lead eventually to disasters, because the risk can only materialize into disaster in the presence of all these factors. In case of the floods, for example, the risk factors could be the increasing population in the wrong places, using the wrong material for housing, like what happened in Nairobi, people living in lowlands and adjacent to the banks. And so when we consider the risk management and adaptation strategies, we have to address these underlying causes and work to reduce poverty, to strengthen the building codes, and to improve the drainage system. So we have to act on the causes of the vulnerability and exposure. Similar to drought also, there is many risk factors that should be considered, like the increasing trends of variabilities, because drought is a slow onset event, it is not sudden, so we have to address these long-term vulnerabilities and climate variabilities, and also population increase in areas with very low carrying capacity, leading to ecosystem degradation and desertification. So our strategies should target all these risk factors. In terms of coastal exposure to coastal cyclones, sea level rise, we should also address risk factors such as erosion. Okay, thank you. I have only 5 minutes, so I have to be fast. Similar to drought and to floods. So now I'm coming to the key messages from the report, and one of these messages that we have an increasing exposure to extreme events, and even without extreme events, still we can have extreme impacts. So it is very important to address issues of exposure. And the other thing is that we have to understand the multifaceted problems of vulnerabilities and to address them rather than focusing on the symptoms, as I have already been mentioned. This is very important, the integration of local knowledge with external scientific and technical knowledge, because we are not going only to teach people what to do. It is very important that any initiative comes from the community themselves, and they should be part of the solution. So it is important to incorporate the local knowledge with the scientific knowledge in addressing disaster risk. The issue of communication, in many cases we have the information, the forecast, but there is a problem with the communication. And it is very important when we communicate the forecast to communicate also the uncertainties and to characterize it, because there is nothing like 100% certainty. And also we have to consider that this information is to be communicated to a wide group of stakeholders with different perceptions, different cultural backgrounds, and we have to consider this, because in many cases, for example, when we talk about increasing rainfall, people perceive that it is a blessing, and we have to show that under certain conditions it could be very devastating, even more than the drought. Issues of inequalities, which influence the local coping and adaptive capacity. It is very challenging because even at the level of countries, developing countries have less adaptive capacity than the developed countries because of poor infrastructure and many factors. There is also disparities across the society, gender, age. These have to be considered. Issues of risk sharing and transfer mechanism, which has already been covered, I think, very well in this forum. A way to reduce the disaster. Also, attention should be given to the temporal and spatial dynamics of vulnerability and exposure. We should not transfer the risk from one place to another, from one stakeholder group to another. We should also not focus on measures that provide short-term solutions, but it can lead to maladaptation in the long term. An example here is the dike system, which can reduce the hazard by offering immediate protection, but also encourage settlement patterns that may increase the risk in the long term. The low regrets measure, which used to be no regret measure, and now it is low regrets, so there is a little regret. For addressing the current disaster risk could lead to long-term benefits, and here we are speaking about the sustainable, for example, sustainable land management, biodiversity conservation, improving infrastructure, health services, all these measures, while it has its immediate impact, but it is also will give long-term benefits. This is the last one. So the need for integration of disaster risk management and adaptation efforts, and to incorporate both into the local and national and international development plans. It's very important, and it will provide benefits at all scales. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Balgis. That was almost like an ignite. Obviously, there's much more in this report, so we encourage you to write down these two links. The second one is a set of regional summaries that have been prepared by the Climate Development Knowledge Network, and that, for instance, include that table with changing extremes that Balgis showed. I think for most people, for you, but particularly for those people you might be working with and policymakers, these regional summaries are actually better material to use even than the original IPCC material. And it has been very strongly peer-reviewed by IPCC coordinating lead authors, so it's very trustworthy material as well. Many messages that won't be unfamiliar to you coming from the disaster risk management world, but I think this report provides a very important place to start discussions between people that have traditionally been more focused on climate change adaptation and people that have been traditionally working more on disaster risk management. Of course, both, and I think that's one of the cross-cutting messages also that's clear from Balgis' presentation, both needing to integrate into the regular development agenda and planning across sectors and scales. I'm very eager to now hand over to Alexis, who will take us a bit further through that sort of planning, and one very practical tool that the African Development Bank is developing to get these sorts of changes factored into regular project design and implementation in the project cycle of the African Development Bank. Alexis, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you. I initially rehearsed my presentation for 30 minutes until Martin's asking me to very politely to confine it within 10 minutes. This morning, he politely again asking me to bring it to not more than 5 minutes. So, and I work in the compliance division, so I try to comply. The bank has two main mandates. It has a development mandate, but it also has fiduciary responsibilities. In the last few years, there's been a realization amongst senior management that both mandates will be severely compromised by climate risk. And so in the bank's medium-term strategy, climate change, it was recognized that climate change was a major threat to Africa's development. And so the bank set out to, made a commitment to support climate resilient development and transition to low carbon economic growth in Africa. And so it also committed to develop interventions in terms of adaptation, mitigation, and financing at the policy project program levels. Now, when they throw this to you as a staff member at the bank, then we set out to reflect on how to implement these objectives. And so this is what led to the development of the bank's climate safeguard system. But before that, the bank adopted a strategy for climate risk management and adaptation, which centers on three main pillars. The first one, to ensure that the bank's projects are screened, climate screened, and that that strategies for adaptations for each project are also developed, and that we should also develop knowledge and guidance for decision making along our project cycle. And so the climate safeguard system was designed to implement this strategy. It is basically part of the implementation of also of the bank's medium-term strategy. It was designed based on an assessment that showed that most of the bank's projects were vulnerable to climate change in the sectors of agriculture, for instance, infrastructure, energy, and water sanitation. So the objective of the CSS was to support the mainstreaming of climate risks, also raise awareness and develop knowledge, also decision-relevant knowledge. Again, with a view to reduce climate vulnerability and promote climate change throughout our operations. Sorry. All right. So the system actually has three main components. Like I said, the screening element. After the screening, and once you've sort of determined the risk profile of the project, and then you develop the adaptation review and evaluation for the project. And then you develop what we call counter-adaptation fact sheets. And this is sort of a fact sheet which was requested by our country economists that needed climate-related information to be included in country strategy papers. And so all of the three pillars would consist, constitute the overall knowledge based within the bank, which would draw from in developing and informing decision-making in our projects, programs, and also in country support policies. And so also the system is designed based on our project cycle, targeting early stage of project preparation. Like I said, we have fiduciary responsibility, and so risks, the understanding of risks and the ability to assign a value or a cost to a risk is very important early on in the design of the project. And so, therefore, so all projects at the bank are meant to go through the screening process and to enable us to determine the climate risk early on. And so now let me just very quickly go through some of the key functionalities of the system. First of all, the screening has 5 major steps. The first step is to select scorecards. The scorecards basically means that you select the sector or the subsector to which the project belongs. And so each subsector, of course, will have its own peculiarities in terms of the risks it faces. And then the second stage enables you to input some main project information. And then the third stage, you answer some options to questions. Now, these questions relate again to some specific risks, risks that are specific to a specific sector. And so, and they are very well, I mean, we spent a lot of time discussing this, and so they are very elaborate, and they are linked to some information databases that are supplied to us by the University of Cape Town. And then the fourth stage gives you options, or the system scores up, and then categorizes the project. It basically assigns a risk category. And then it generates information which you export to the project concept note. The project concept note is a document which is very important, which will move throughout the project cycle along the various decision-making nodes. Now, just to explain the various types of risk categories, we have category 1, and these are projects which are very vulnerable to climate risk, which require detailed evaluation of climate change risk and adaptation measures, where comprehensive and practical risk management and adaptation measures are integrated in project design and implementation plans. Category 2 projects, these are projects which may be vulnerable to climate risk, which require review of climate change risk and adaptation measures, and where practical risk management adaptation options are also integration in project design and implementation plans. And the third category actually consists of projects which are not very risky and where any intervention is non-mandatory. Now, I will skip these slides. These basically are frames which have been captured to show you how you move from stage 1 to stage 5, where you select scorecards and then input some key project information and also actually identify the main activities of the project. And then and actually also move on to questions, specific questions, like I said, which relate to climate change. For instance, if the project, one of the is in the agriculture, cropping and irrigation, for instance, there will be specific questions such as, you know, whether water resource availability for irrigation is not relevant for the project, where irrigation activities are planned in an area where rainfall exceeds evaporation throughout the year, where irrigation activities are planned in an area which with seasonal or variable rainfall distribution with moderate to high evaporation. So very specific, specialized sort of questions that are linked to climate risks. And then you are given options. I mean, the system scores up depending on how you responded. And this information, of course, is exported to the project concept note. That is a decision document which comes out. Now, like I said, this is the screening process really comes early on in the project assessment. And so the project, you initially would have a project brief. And so once you undertake the screening, and you come out with some information in terms of the climate risks associated with the project, the information is, the document is consolidated with the information that came out from the system. And so, so you come out in the end with a project concept note, which triggers another process of appraisal. For instance, for category 1 projects, which are highly risky, you have a number of steps that are recommended. You go through 8 steps to actually now review again the risky project. You select adaptation purpose and components. You select adaptation activities, prepare terms of reference for further evaluation of the project. You produce outputs for the project concept note. You commission an expert study. You produce an adaptation evaluation report and summary, determine project viability, and produce final output for project planning. So this is a very, very tedious process. Then you go through actually to ensure that each and every project is climate proof. Now, these are the key outputs for the project concept notes. You, like I said, you have an adaptation purpose and component template, adaptation activities template, and terms of reference. And so you also, of course, generate information which are left into the CSS knowledge base. And then you also produce internal recommendation to project managers that need to make fiduciary decisions. Right. So in terms of adaptation planning, and I can see Martin's again enforcing his, okay. Okay, so this is one of the final slides. Again, once you've gone through the screening process and so forth, you come up with what you can adjusted project result-based logical framework. So this is the document, decision document you come up, which would have all consolidated all the information, risk assessment information, going through all the stages. And so, of course, in the end, you would have country adaptation fact sheets. These are fact sheets which generate climate information, which are used in also at the program and country policy level. And this information is mainly used by the country economists in designing country strategy papers. So now, the information used, like I said, is mainly supplied by the University of Cape Town. It's, the data is collected from agroecological zones in Africa, climate envelopes, country information, relevant documents, which are also used in extracting the essence to this. And so I must say that the project, the system now is being piloted by our operational departments. And so we're also adding the mitigation part. And so we hope to launch it in the next few months. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this is something to contemplate also for the disaster risk management community, because as far as I'm aware, there are only 1 or 2 development banks that have systematically integrated disaster risk into their safeguard systems. I think the Caribbean Development Bank does it, and I think 1 or 2 others were considering it at some point. Doing this systematically, of course, offers an opportunity to look not just at the risks like in an environmental safeguard that the project poses to the environment, but actually look systematically in every project to the risk that the environment poses to the project. And in principle, that's an opportunity not just for the long-term climate risks, but also for these extreme risks that we're concerned about. And I think it makes perfect sense to just make sure that that's one integrated set of safeguards for the entire set of extremes, also including the non-climate extremes. That's, I think, a community question for all of you that we can debate further. I realized I didn't allow any questions with Baugitz's presentation, so let's quickly see if there are any technical questions for the first 2 presentations right now. Yeah.
Yes, I thank you for the presentation. It consider it very interesting. I'm Jaap Kwadijk from Deltaris from the Netherlands, and I'm in the business of climate change also for a while. But I was thinking, is in the report on climate change, are there really also specifically risks addressed to climate change mitigation addressed? Because all these risks, what we see, we know them basically, and they can become worse or less due to climate change. But there is also a risk that we are going to fight climate change by using biofuels and change agricultural land into land that is used for production of biofuels. Now that I would consider a real climate change risk, because then climate change would be a risk, fighting climate change would be a risk for food production. Is that addressed in this report?
The quick answer is no, that was outside of the mandate of the report. There are other types of risks like this. I think geoengineering, for instance, is another type of risk like that was clearly outside of the mandate of this report. I would say that the discussions in the IPCC community in the context of this report have put a number of these issues on the agenda for the next big assessment report, which is coming out in 2 years. Other questions for Balgus or Alexis at this point? Otherwise, I suggest we continue. There's room for discussion after the 3 presentations. So I'm very happy to introduce Sophia from the World Bank, currently based in Zambia, but with, as I said, experience all around the world on these topics. And she'll talk us through, yeah, just click. It's one presentation. One more. Yeah. Instruments, incentives, and institutions.
Good morning, everyone. My presentation is going to focus on going from assessment of risks to decision making, and it's going to be based on our experience on programs at the national level, and particularly on 3 major challenges that we have been facing: instruments, incentives, and institutions, and how to best coordinate them. First of all, who are the key decision makers at the national level? And this pertains to both Africa as well as Asia. The first one is politicians. Policymakers are often politicians also in Africa, especially from the directorship up. Traditional leaders play a very important role. The people in vulnerable areas, and finally donors. Those are the key decision makers at the national level. There are other stakeholders, but these are generally the ones that have decision powers. So those are the ones that we need to convince through our instruments. There's no point in preaching to the converted if we cannot influence the people that are actually in charge of decisions. The 3 I's that we call them is choosing the right instruments, addressing incentives, which are often hidden, and setting up the right institutions. The first one is instruments. These are the type of instruments that we have found so far to be the most useful. First of all, simple climate forecasts. By that we mean, and my colleague Pablo has given a very good allegory of what is a typical climate forecast. The probability of precipitation above normal, as defined by the top tercile of historical records of precipitation, is now enhanced from 33% to between 45 and 50%. Now, when you go to talk to traditional leaders in the Zambezi, and you give this type of forecast, they are just left going, duh. And they go back to their traditional methods of climate forecasting. So it's really important to convey this in a way that they can understand. The second one is simple screening tools for the main sectors. And by simple screening tools, we mean screening tools that decision makers can use to mainstream the main documents, the ones that are costed and the ones that matter at the national level. By that, we do not mean NAPAs, we do not mean NAMAs, we do not mean YOGO frameworks. We mean the national development plans, the budget, the key sectoral policy and sectoral plans. Those are the ones that matter. Those are the ones that carry weight. And those are the ones that need to reflect climate resilience. Alternatively, if you do not have the type of screening tools that our colleagues have been developing at AFDB, it also works to embed a panel of highly respected experts. This was done in Zambia. They chose a panel of 4 very highly conceived, very highly respected panelists. The same thing was done in Japan after the Great Eastern Japanese earthquake. And they are listened to by politicians. Economic analysis, very, very important. And finally, risk maps. The very important aspect is that finances should consistently and progressively reward early preventive action. If financing is given despite of early action, there's no incentive to do it because there's a market failure, fundamental market failure. Participatory risk mapping, I'm very glad to say that we have in the room one of the colleagues that has helped develop this map for São Tomé, Carlos Dias. And this type of participatory mapping has been done all over the world. It is important because it allows users to jointly visualize what is their present risk, start getting more awareness of it, and also allow them to come to future options. But at the same time, plans tend to be unfunded and tend to be unimplemented. So this is a major constraint that continues. Economic analysis have been very useful, for example, in Pacific and Mozambique, to really harness the decision makers' willingness to invest in adaptation. In the Pacific, it was done in the year 2000, and it formed the basis for a major program that is now expanding to about 3 or 4 countries in the Pacific. In Mozambique, it also provided the basis for a program that is now estimated at more than 600 million. But the problem is using the right instruments is just not enough. You have to get the right behavior, and that's where the issue of incentives becomes very strongly needed. While you may say, what is the risk to us? What is the risk to the communities? The politician is thinking, what is the risk that I run if I do nothing? I'm leaving in 3 years, so why should I care? You know? Do I really run a risk that there'll be a major disaster that will depose me from my post? That's what they think, and you need to address that. Otherwise, you're not effective in getting to the people that really decide things. So the first thing we know is uncertainty leads to inertia. If you come out and say that the probability of precipitation is unknown, nobody will take action on that. People tend to underestimate risk. We all know that. There are very few rewards for early action. Preventive action does not make news. We all know that. Disasters make news. But to take preventive action is never going to land in a newspaper. And therefore politicians are also not very, very keen on it. But donors face exactly the same dilemma. I cannot tell you how many times we argued with prominent donors in Madagascar about the advantages of building 50 safe schools over building 100 unsafe schools. For the majority of the people, building 100 schools is much more rewarding. They could care less whether they're safe or unsafe. By then they have moved countries. So the same type of disincentives applies to donors. So how do we address them? The first one is to look beyond the iceberg. Look at the structural issue. Look at the real motivation of decision makers. Understand them first, and then try to address them as much as you can. Often is incentives, salary top-ups, access to per diems. These are very important things. You cannot neglect them. A lot of times we say they are ineligible, we do not fund them, we do not care about them, those are public administration issues. But they are fundamentally important, and they come up over and over again in these programs. The other one is to use peer pressure. And by that, we also mean raising it in the media, making politicians care, making politicians start to pay attention and say, well, maybe this is something that I should be aware of. Use command and control. Simply impose them like it's being done in Africa Development Bank. A lot of task team leaders will not agree with it. But once it becomes mandatory, then it is something that they have to comply. Demonstrate. Use very visible win-wins. In Zambia, we are doing a climate resilience of a road that hopefully will link Victoria Falls to Kafue National Parks on an all-weather passage so that you can actually pass all year round. That is very visible. That attracts a lot of attention from policymakers. And finally, address those personal disincentives directly. There are ways. Where there's a will, there's a way. And I can tell you that we have done things in some countries that would not be normally eligible, but that because of the particular circumstances of the country had to be allowed, like top up in salaries. That has happened. And it's perhaps the last resource, but one needs to. Finally, setting up the right institutions. This is probably the next World Cup final. We all know this is going on. We have created a monster, two monsters. And the institutional fights that are going on, even in very, very, very small places like Kiribati, where I worked with Martin, which at the time had only 80,000 people. But the institutional fights between Ministry of Environment and the other groups were ferocious, and they continue to this day. Okay, how do we actually deal with this? Some of the early lessons, and I'm not going to say they are proven, they're starting to emerge. First of all, there is some evidence that climate risk management requires a strong central coordination because you are dealing with ministries that are much more powerful than ministries of environment or home affairs, such as public works, one of the early ministries in many, many countries. Those are powerful ministries. You cannot have a weak ministry ordering around a strong ministry. It just doesn't work. So there's some evidence that you should be placing this responsibility at a very high-level institution, close to economic planning, either ministries of finance, offices of the president, offices of prime minister. There is some early evidence emerging also in Africa that this is the way to go. Implementation, however, should not fall on those units. Implementation should continue to be under the sectoral ministries. Otherwise, they are seen as a direct competition and they are formally boycotted or informally boycotted. And this is happening in many countries. Adaptation disaster risk management should preferably be handled by the same institution, leaving disaster response to where disaster response falls. Disaster response is typically a responsibility that is self-contained. Disaster risk management is a distraction from the disaster response institutions. And disaster risk management and adaptation are very, very close together. But response is a little different. And we can talk more about that. The last one is invest in a wide group of early to mid-career champions. I cannot overemphasize how important this is. Do not invest in the top brass. The top brass leaves. Do not invest in one person or two people. Invest in a wide group. Because these people, once they become good, are in very high demand. You have a ring-a-more of international conventions, international funds, international organizations. They will poach them. So you have to invest in a wider group of pretty young champions that will lead the program. Anyway, I finished here. If there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sophia. So some big questions for all your modeling work, all your risk assessment work, in terms of what we need to do to get this agenda moving in the real world. We've got a couple of those themes coming up in the panel discussion in a few minutes, but let me first ask if there are any immediate questions. No questions? Then let's head into the panel. Oh, there's a question there. Pablo.
Just very quickly, thank you, Sophia. How much research, if any, is being done on the behavioral side of how real people who make decisions respond to these apparently under-addressed incentives and disincentives? Do we know what's going on? Are we documenting it? what works, what doesn't, or is it just inside debates based on random observation?
I've seen very little done on it. There was a group actually, I think at the last Understanding Risk conference that was focusing on that. But there's been very little formal research done on it. It's more from talking to politicians. It's more from meeting with parliamentarians and seeing how their incentives work. The one thing that tends to work is peer pressure. If the parliamentarians are together with other parliamentarians of other African countries, they start seeing that way. If Kenya is doing that, why aren't we doing it in Zambia or in Mozambique? So that type of peer pressure tends to work, and the same thing applies at the community level. But formal research, I think it's a field that is largely underexplored.
Thanks. And there's room for a session at the next Understanding Risk conference. There's an agenda there for 2 years of interesting work. Anyone else? Yep, please.
Hi, Claire Davis from the CSR. Now, with my experience with some decision makers in this sort of field, they question their own behavior and their own behavioral change. They think, you know, we're making changes in policy, but how can we go home and make changes in our own lives? So how can you suggest taking these sort of approaches and seeing how, you know, this could link to behavioral changes as well within institutions and with people themselves?
I think it depends very much whether those politicians have an allegiance to their constituency or not. You know, that's not necessarily the case with many politicians. Many politicians are more interested in their own promotion, and one has to understand whether the most powerful politicians are the ones that have just personal motivations, personal growth, whether they're managing up or they're managing down. If they're managing down towards their constituencies, then they are listening to their constituencies, and they're generally very open and receptive to disaster risk management. If they are managing up, they couldn't care two hoots about it. And then only the command and control or the media action or the peer pressure will work.
One final question from Baugis.
Yeah. Just would like to know how can we harness the local institutions and the local knowledge in order to address issues of disasters.
I think through integration into decentralized planning. And this depends very much on whether the countries have already gone towards both decentralization and fiscal decentralization. In countries like Ethiopia, where you have had a lot more decentralization, I think you can get to the point where people start planning, integrating disaster risk management, drought management into their own spatial planning, and they have access to small pools of contingency funding which they can use to prepare for next seasons. In other countries where there is no decentralized financing, where fiscal decentralization has not progressed, it's much more difficult because they're still conditioned by the central government dictates. But the way to move it, the way we have been moving, is very much integrating it into local planning. And that could be as ad hoc as it is necessary for action to take place. So it could be a formalized area development plan, or it could be just an informal planning process that communities go through.
One more question.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Anay Brewer from the National Disaster Management Centre in South Africa. You mentioned that it is ideal that the same institution looks at climate risk management and disaster risk management. And I would like, I think often in countries it is driven by two different ministries. And I would like to know if you could give some, you know, advice or some from your experience how to actually promote that idea, because I think there's lots of structures that are actually duplicating, and you know, one can actually strengthen those structures rather to work together in the same for the same goal.
I don't think there's one model. I think that the model of just setting up informal coordination mechanisms can also work, but it's not perhaps the most ideal. The key question is whether the institutions in charge have the power, the mandate, and the strength to influence the ministries that matter. The ministries that matter are often agriculture, are infrastructure, are home affairs, are finance. And very often, the place where the climate change adaptation and disaster risk management are placed, the traditional places, which is environment and home affairs, are much younger ministries, much more junior ministries. So the degree of mainstreaming is automatically curtailed by their power to influence. Now, whether they are jointly together or not, normally, if they are under the same ministry, it's much easier for people to actually participate in a committee or work together than it is if they are parts of different ministries, just because of self-promotion aspects or the fact that people are driven towards going to the COBs, and they're constantly traveling, etc. It's much more difficult for that group to actually work together. That's from our experience, but there's not a single formula that has emerged. I think this is just still emerging evidence that it is best to elevate it, and it is best to merge it if the functions are similar.
Thanks, Sophia. This recommendation is also shining through very strongly from the IPCC SREX report, so I think this is a sort of common knowledge. How to do it in practice is of course, highly context-specific. And there's a lot of politics, just like with all the politics, that prevents the early action, that prevents this sort of institutional integration. I think one thing from those people in international institutions, one thing we can do is lead by example. And that's not the case in all international institutions, unfortunately, yet. So.
Just to conclude, in Zambia it has taken 2.5 years of discussions, and it's still not concluded. But at the end, the important thing is to leave the decision at the national level. I mean, donors should not be the ones pointing the finger and saying, please do it here or do it there. If the decision is owned at the national level, then it sticks. Very often, if it's imposed, it just falls through.
Thanks, Sophia. Then we'll head to the second part of the discussion. And I would like to ask the presenters and also the additional panelists to either come and sit at this podium or here on this side, take a couple of chairs forward. That also gives us a bit more of a discussion flavor to the setup of the room. So please come forward and come onto the podium. Yeah, all the speakers and the additional presenters. And we've roughly got two little blocks for you. One more on the climate information side and how we get the climate information right to get the sort of change that we've been discussing. And secondly, on this national and local implementation. And we've got a couple of statements set up for you on the screen, with which we'll ask you to either agree or disagree. You agree by standing up, you disagree by sitting down. And I'll come around with the mic, and I'll ask you why you've made a choice. So if you stay seated, you've also made a choice, and you may get the mic. So here's the first statement. And this is essentially asking the question, in this whole set of priorities, we've got a limited budget to invest in disaster risk management, in climate risk reduction, adaptation to climate change. Should generation and communication of climate information be a priority? Is that where we're going to put an important chunk of our marginal dollars when we're going to be investing in this agenda? Who agrees? Please stand up. Wow, that's let's see, anyone? Oh, no, the last ones that were still sitting are starting. Is anyone still sitting? No, you're going to be the, got someone over there. Oh, sorry, can I just, can you pass it on?
Say something.
Please introduce yourself and maybe stand up for a few.
Hamish Hall of Royal Haskoning. You're standing in front of the question, so if you could just move, I can read it again. Thank you. I think climate change information is hard to communicate and quite often you're flogging a dead horse trying to communicate that information to some stakeholders. Often it's necessary just to make the intervention and to do what the government or the governance thinks is best as the intervention, rather than to invest more time and effort trying to communicate something that maybe isn't at the forefront of people's minds. If I've read the question right.
Yeah. And your neighbor maybe also get a second comment?
Yeah, hi, Brandon Jongman from the Institute of Environmental Studies in Netherlands. My point is that I think that we have a lot of climate information, and it's already, as my neighbor said, it's very hard to communicate. And I think now where more information is needed is on the risk side. So if the last sentence is climate risk reduction, I think climate information, we have a lot of climate information, we need more climate information. I think we need more risk information on what is the exposure of vulnerability and the actual effect of the climate information.
Thanks very much. And that's actually a perspective that I would have expected from many more people in this audience. So let's, well actually, before you sit down, gentlemen, may I ask you, why did you agree?
To what?
To the statement. You stood up, so you agreed we need, if we have a limited amount of money, we should spend it on more, we should a chunk of it on more climate information and communication of that climate information.
Well, okay. First of all, I'm Francisco Dams from Provincial Disaster Management, Western Cape. The reason I agreed with the statement is that you always need a starting point, and for some people and policy decision makers, they need to do a bit of catch up. So whilst we do need to invest in more climate risk information, the background information is also important, I feel.
Okay. Thanks very much. Let's hear from two of our expert panelists here. Firstly, maybe, well, we've got two expert climate information providers here. Let's first hear from ICPAC. Abdi Shakur Otawai actually has a background in disaster risk management, but is now in ICPAC, the regional climate provider in East Africa. You must be happy with this massive response from the audience asking for your services.
I appreciate that, and it's a challenge we've been facing for a long time. How to translate climate information into a language that is easily understandable by local communities, and there's been a lot of challenges in terms of how the content should be designed. You know, you put in a lot of scientific details and it won't be understandable on the ground. You remove some of the details and the message will be watered down. So we're actually having a project that is we have hired communication experts who are working on designing the content of what can be communicated and what cannot be communicated, and how it should be communicated and which media to use.
Great, thanks. So it's interesting to see on and I think it's a trend worldwide also with this global framework for climate services that's probably going to be discussed in the WMO session later, but that you see much more emphasis among the climate service providers on the communication of their information as well, and trying to address some of the questions that Sophia posed as well. Mark, what's your perspective on that? And maybe also asking that question, we highlighted in this IPCC SREX report that there seems to have been a trend a bit away from just looking at average conditions in 2100, more to asking a question, what climate information do we really need? What's your experience providing that information in Africa?
Okay, I mean, I think the big issue is defining what we mean by climate information. And I think one of the critical issues is that clearly if there isn't climate information, you can't really make decisions, but we need to be thinking about what a kind of a minimum standard of climate information is, because climate information is a bottomless pit. You speak to a climate scientist and they'll always be able to go away and find something to do that they can generate some more information. But I think over much of Africa, there's either zero information or very limited information. So I think we need to sort of put effort into defining what, a bit like you have a basic human right to water, which is 20 liters a day or whatever. There's a basic human right to climate information, and there's some minimum standard that we should all be trying to target, a bit like I suppose a Millennium Development Goal or something like that for climate information. So that's really my take. But then the second side of it is, if you have that climate information available, and by that I mean kind of data, then the critical issue is around the dissemination of that data, so the correct channels. And so it's kind of a two-stage process. You can't do the dissemination without the climate information, but you've got to be strategic about what you invest in terms of climate information to get to some minimum standard that is fit for purpose.
Thanks. And maybe as an add-on, that question of timescales, because I saw Sophia mentioning the seasonal timescale as being one of the areas where there was low-hanging fruit, and that's an experience we also have in the Red Cross, that people are pretty good at using short-term early warning information, maybe 2-3 hours in advance of a disaster, maybe a few days at most. They're getting interested in this really long-term, the 2050, 2100 climate information, but there's probably lower-hanging fruit for some of their decision-making on intermediate timescales. There's a lot of investment in the climate information community, I know, at the decadal timescale. Should we be expecting anything from that?
Okay, well, my personal view is that anything beyond 2050 is almost a waste of investment because of the decision timescales that operate in most developing countries. There are very few decisions that actually play out over more than 30 or 40 years. So we shouldn't be thinking 2100. And my other reason for that is that I don't think we're going to have any improvement in the quality of the information from a decision point of view in terms of those long decision timescales. It's going to take a step change in climate modeling and climate science capacity to reduce the uncertainties in a way that actually makes a difference from a decision point of view. So I think it's basically from the interesting timescales are from daily, which is, if you like, operational disaster risk issues, through to weekly and seasonal, which you might call tactical, which is where you're sort of trying to organize yourself to be in a position to manage emerging risk, and then through to something that's more strategic, which is on maybe the 1 to 10 year timescale, which is deciding how to invest your resources, where you want to put your resources longer term. So that's where I think the focus needs to be. And the big information gap at the moment is probably going beyond the seasonal timescale to the decadal timescale. So for those who work in seasonal forecasting, if you think seasonal forecasting is difficult, try decadal forecasting. It's kind of so we've got a real problem there, and I think the issue there is that we shouldn't be talking about decadal forecasts in the same way that, in fact, people in the seasonal forecast community tend to talk more about outlooks now. I think we should be thinking about decadal outlooks and using multiple sources of data to try and get a better handle on what the risk envelope is going to look like over that 10-year timescale. So is it the same as the last 10 years? Is it going to change in a way that actually potentially affects the strategic decisions you're going to make? And that kind of information is really important. So is there an area that's currently a disaster hotspot from a climatic point of view going to remain that way, or is it going to perhaps going to become less hot? And are there going to be new hotspots that emerge over the next 1 to 10 years? And what's the probability of that? Trying to, sorry to use the probability term there, but what's the likelihood of these new hotspots emerging? I think we can start to inform strategic decision making in that way, but you're never going to get the kind of forecast that one gets on the daily to weekly timescale.
Great, thanks very much. Very insightful and helpful. And I think there's tremendous steps being made in the climate science community, getting these messages across. And there's an element of education, reducing some of the expectations that sometimes exist once people get enthusiastic about adaptation to climate change. That sometimes there are limits to what can be provided, but there is useful stuff there, and we need to find that optimum in terms of where the right information can be fitted to the right sort of decisions that can be informed by it. Abdi.
I wanted to share with you a project the ICPAC and Kenya Meteorological Department piloted in Western Kenya. It is a project where scientists and traditional rainmakers came together. It's in Western Kenya. It is in Kisumu, and the community is called Ngani community. And this is where they are the traditional African rainmakers, you know, the ones who are given a bull. The community gives them a bull and say, make for us rain. But usually they will not accept the fee until the conditions are right. They do forecasting. They do forecasting, and when the conditions are right is when they accept the fee. So what actually the meteorologists did, the meteorologists told them, do your forecasting, we'll do ours. So they did theirs, they come and they present their result. The meteorologists do their forecasting, they come and do their result, and the results are identical.
There should only be parity.
Well, they don't accept the fee. They will give you an impossible condition when the situation is not, when the conditions are not right. They will tell you, bring a blue lion if you want rain. So this is just and that knowledge is being documented. You know, indigenous knowledge. It's called indigenous knowledge in Inganyi community in Western Kenya. It's been documented. 3-4 books have been written about it. It's a project between Kenya Met Department, ICPAC, and Maseno University. And we want to use that, you know, in traditional media for transmitting, you know, meteorological and climate information. Thanks.
There is a web space for this theme in this conference. I've added a few resources, but it's not used very actively yet. What I suggest is if you have a couple of links to this, that we add it to that forum so that people will be able to find it there if they're interested. And the same applies to any other themes that come up or interesting ideas that you've got. Please visit us at that forum and just add a couple of... I don't think we can expect a very lively discussion given how busy you all are, but if we can just use it as a repository for some of these links, I think that's a very valuable contribution. I'm eager to go on to the next topic, as rich as this is. I see all of these things as starters for further debate over coffee. The lack of international climate finance is the key bottleneck for better climate risk reduction. Who agrees? No one? Well, this is fantastic. If we had had this same question up in a climate-oriented community, everyone would be standing right now. Or maybe 90% would be standing right now. So it's very healthy you don't see it this way. The challenge that we tried to raise with this question was, of course, the issue that there is a wait-and-see attitude in many institutions that are dealing with these questions. That they're saying, if we don't get the international grant money, we're not going to act on this agenda. And there's real challenges there in terms of moving the joint agenda, because this international climate finance is sometimes stopping some of the actors on the climate side to engage on the disaster risk management side if they don't yet get the finance. Youssef, any comments from your perspective working with disaster risk management institutions at the national level and how they're linking to this international climate finance architecture?
Yes. I will not link it to climate to finance from the beginning, which means we are dealing with disaster risk reduction, and I think during this last 10 years we failed to address vulnerability and exposure. I'm not talking yet about the climate change and the changing climate, just addressing exposure of the population, that they come to live in the safe place, and addressing poverty, which is one of the vulnerability drivers, the most important. And now, while the public health as well as other sectors are talking more about important risk in the future, then the IPCC work, the expertise of different colleagues come to say, we are having one more problem now. The climate is changing, extremes are more, and the uncertainties are growing. Now we have to address the three issues in the same time: reducing the exposure, reducing vulnerability, and adapting to the new context of variable changing, difficult to capture them. As one of our experts said yesterday, we have to prepare for potential different futures. As you say, the global picture, when you try to put it in terms of changing climate at local level, is not yet there clear. Then we have to prepare for changes, even if you are not sure which changes are. I think the mainstream in this approach is to use the IPCC SREX report as the opportunity to bring now all those people together. One, the climate change adaptation sector, the disaster risk reduction sector, and the sustainable development sector, as all of us have a sort of a piece of the whole cake to approach it. The strategies should be more multi-sectorial, but we need a leadership. Someone at government level should play a leadership to bring water sector, which is impacted by the climate change, food security issues impacted by the climate change, health issues. You know, in Africa is meningitis and malaria who kills more, and all are climato-sensitive, as we say in French, you know, sensitive to climate. And all this should come now. Don't leave only the response, which we need it yet and always, but bring also the climate finance, because the insurance in Africa is not yet developed, and use this climate SREX report as an opportunity to do more, not to give up. And the last point is that I come just from Dakar. We launched the SREX report, and one of the mayor from a small city says, we feel that we are the most affected by the climate change, but we are the one who has the less knowledge to put it in municipality development plan. The one who are affected are the one who do not have tools to put the solution for the climate change impact, you know, to fight them, of course, in the municipality development plans. Then I think there is also something to do about this national plan translated into local action through appropriate architecture of the institutional frameworks. How are we going to channel funding, etc.? Of course, for this question, I have to say, we are being a bit annoyed about the climate finance complex mechanisms. When they put some finance adaptation fund, and then you look at how to access it, then you lose your things. It's too difficult to access it. I think I have to say that about this, even if it's not finance the only problem. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. And your almost final remark right away leads us to the next statement, which is that national policy intentions seldom lead to better climate risk management outcomes at the local level. And this statement is partly inspired by the views from the Frontline report that was done by the civil society network that's working with the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, and monitoring alongside government reporting on the Hyogo framework the local implementation of that, and actually found that in many countries where governments are reporting a lot of progress in terms of the policy environment, little of that is filtering through to the local level. And James Kisia, you're working in the Kenya Red Cross, you're dealing with local communities in your daily work. How do you see that link between the national policies in your government and the local implementation in the communities in Kenya?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is not a linear relationship or binary. It's a bit more complicated with some bottlenecks. Yes, policies are important, and policymakers do need evidence to make policy. But oftentimes, politicians are quite politicians and even policymakers, by the nature of their work, are proficient in superficiality, maybe extreme superficiality. And that makes it very difficult for them to translate that policy, or to participate in the translation of that policy into activities. I think you have heard from the presentation that was given by Sophia about some of the issues with asymmetry of power in ministries, and that goes all the way down. And with these kind of asymmetries, we have terminologies that have emerged, like a powerful ministry, or terminology as a senior minister, or a technician working for a senior person. And I think some of the major bottlenecks are the fact that between the technical people who are producing the evidence and the people implementing and the policymakers, that there needs to be some other kind of capacities, someone who can have his foot or her foot in technical and in political. Now, there's, there are very few in our setting, and oftentimes we find that these policies just remain there without being read, without being cascaded down. Then the other thing is that the evidence now that is produced by doing on the ground is again not picked up because the people who are doing may not necessarily be the best placed people to document and take that up as evidence to policy level.
So a two-way street, calling also for better documentation of what's really happening on the ground. Do that more systematically also at national level. Let's hear from you. Who agrees with this statement? No one agrees? Okay, so let's hear from you. So you're saying that national policies mostly do lead to better action on the ground. That national policy improvement is the most important step to get to better local risk reduction. Can you comment on that?
Thank you. I'm John T. from the South African, one of the provinces, KZN, Provincial Adjustment Center. If the center does not hold all the intentions, nothing is going to happen. All I'm saying that if there are no national policy intentions that look down what is going to happen on the ground, we certainly are not going to achieve in making sure that the climate risk management at local level is being succeeded. But what is fundamental is that it does not only become the top-down kind of approach, but it also needs to look at the local aspirations of the people. I subscribe to the notion that says the needs of the people can best be identified by the people themselves on the ground. The policymakers should also understand what is happening on the ground before you can actually pronounce any particular policy. For me, it is indeed important that the national policy intentions must be integral in ensuring that the climate risk management at local level happens. Instead of saying national policy intentions seldom lead to better, I'll say it should often lead to, not only seldom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Youssef, you're leading the mayor's discussion this afternoon on risk reduction, and I know that I think ICLE is actually partnering with you this afternoon on that, and they've worked a lot with mayors around the world on climate resilience, and they're working on disaster risk reduction. I sometimes feel that there's more energy there than in a lot of climate adaptation policy making at the national level. What's your experience on this question?
At mayor level, I think now they have no choice. They should tackle this question and translate it into disaster risk management integrated in city development plans. Why? If you look at the movement now and the main three indicators of cities in Africa, you will find one, more population are going to cities, then the resources are there. Two, the GDP produced by cities is highest than outside the cities. Three, the risks are growing along with the population and the GDP production and the resource production. Then we have these three going and parallel proportional histograms. More population, more development in terms of GDP, and more risk associated, including violence and this factor of not just classic risk, but factors for political instability. Then should we leave the natural disaster happening, extreme events happening, bringing and wiping out the development gains? Or should we protect through disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation program the stable development and social equilibrium? And this is bit what we are discussing with local authorities and bringing the national authorities in the discussion, that today local actions around urban risks should be a sort of priority action in risk reduction for the future.
And that's primarily on the disaster risk management side. Now maybe let's hear from Sophia, because you've been addressing this question of local implementation within a national policy framework in many countries, including currently in the pilot program for climate resilience, which is climate oriented. How do you know that you are addressing the longer term climate aspects also at the local level, even though so many of these pressing issues that Yusuf is also describing are essentially current disaster risk management? How do you factor in the climate smart elements in that transfer from national to local?
I think it depends a lot on the risk governance of the country as well as the sector. For naturally, some sectors lead themselves much better to the longer term planning. For example, energy has to be, if you're doing a dam, if you're building a series of dams in a certain river in Africa, you have to look at the 100-year horizon for your modeling. If you're building a road, you have to look at 25-year or 30-year horizon. If you're dealing with agriculture, you're dealing with a year-to-year variability. So it depends a lot on the sector. It also depends on how well the risk governance is working at the country level. In Samoa, Japan, and Indonesia, you have very good examples where the national government has set in place a framework, an enabling framework. They have not dictated the policies. They just set in place an enabling framework so that the local governments, the local communities can propose policies and investments on their own. In Japan, actually, the entire reconstruction area is now a special reconstruction zone, and people can actually propose to the Prime Minister policies and tax incentives that they feel is appropriate for their own prefectures. And this is an innovation. Now, in many other countries in Africa, that risk governance simply does not exist. And the national policymakers are completely disassociated from the needs of the very poor, who are the most vulnerable, who are the people that are actually suffering mostly from climate change. So they do not care a hoot about what is happening in Western Province. They do not care a hoot what is happening in the compounds. It does not influence their own political constituencies. So that depends. I think we have to play with heightening the risk governance and also playing on a sector-by-sector basis on whether we need to plan on a much longer-term basis or on a shorter one.
Excellent. Alexis, any final thoughts from your side? We're approaching, was there a question there? Yes. We're approaching, well actually we're already in coffee time. But I'm just, so those of you who want to head out, I'd say, feel free to quietly disappear. We'll try and wrap up in about 5 minutes.
Thank you. I think the issue should be whether the legal framework allows the policy to be operationalized. Because how many of us here have a legal background in this room? If you don't have the constitutional mandate, the legal mandate doesn't allow a mayor to do anything so that money can be also allocated, then I think you can have the policy, but nothing is going to happen. And I think this has been one of the major gaps in disaster risk reduction and also mainstreaming. In Ghana, for example, we've been trying to mainstream DRR and DRM for a very long time. And I think we are facing series of failures because the lawyers don't understand what we're trying to do in this room. And so it doesn't translate really into the policy. Yes, we may have a document that they call policy, but it's not a policy because it has to be vested in a mandate. So I think even in this discussion, we have not even touched on that. And without that, I'm a lawyer, so I speak like one, but I'm also a public health professional, and I score public health in Ghana, University of Ghana. This is what we're trying to do to bring the practitioners, the lawyers, and everybody else because of the multifaceted nature of disaster management, so that we can all sit together. And when we try that in a public health bill and brought lawyers and trained them for about a week so that they can go back and draft the bill, we saw a different kind of thinking and approach to the drafting of the law. So I think we need to pay attention to that aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And many countries are actually drafting climate bills as we speak. So training those lawyers for those two fields at once, I think, would be an excellent way forward and a very good investment. I'm aware that there's probably many burning issues, but I think we should leave them for over coffee. I just want to give the floor finally to Alexis to give some final reflections from the African Development Bank practice side before I wrap up.
Thank you. We do experience, let's say, even within the organization, the difference between the policy people in the bank and what they think and how the various initiatives are practiced at the low level. So, you know, really this is, so I think the issue of capacity is very important. You know, most of resources, people are able to implement this, concentrate at the higher level, at the high policy level, whereas the lower policy level, you know, the local levels where the people are really, you know, you really have facing a dearth of capacity. So, for instance, in decentralization setting, and I used to work in Mali, and so when they were trying to decentralize their health system, so nothing was happening locally. And so at the higher level, people say, no, il faut que les gens prennent le pouvoir. You know, we have decentralized in the text, but they have to capture, to seize that opportunity and capture that power. In Rwanda, people were complaining that, oh, so they decentralized work but not resources. So what I mean is that, and you know that if you decentralize resources, professionals, you know, a lot of people, you know, in terms of labor movement, we move also to work locally because there will be ample resources to do that. So that's probably what I can say at this point. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much. And I think this is one of the key areas where we'll be struggling over the coming years, again, connecting all of these different agendas together, because there is a lot of national policy on climate happening. There's an increasing impetus for national policy on disaster risk management. I often don't see it filtering through for all of these different reasons to the local level. But at the same time, there is a lot of very interesting action at the local level that we can learn from. And I think one of the key conclusions here is that we need to document more what is working well and make sure those lessons are shared and learned. And I think that's one of the calls to this community as well. Work with all these exciting initiatives on the ground to make sure we get those messages out. Get the new exciting climate information tailored, and again, document that so that we can do it at wider scales. Use the new exciting innovations in you know, big development bank thinking that are going to try and integrate this into all of their projects. That will also provide all kinds of entry points for further action on the ground. I'm going to leave it at that with one final ad. Well, two final ads, actually. The session right after this, so just go down, grab a quick coffee, come back up, is James Kisia's session on community risk, which will, I think, seamlessly lead on from this, this session in terms of some of the discussions we were just having. Highly recommended. Again, this room in about 15 minutes. Secondly, I wanted to invite you over lunch around 1 at the Ignite stage, which is at the far end of the lunchroom, where my colleague Pablo Suarez will be playing with us, with you, one of these games that we have tried to use to get a local understanding of how climate risks are affecting decision making, how information needs to be filtered into practice, to get people activated and to get their brain spinning instead of just dumping IPCC reports on them. So I invite you to experience that game over lunch. Just grab your lunch and then come along. You can stand aside or you can actually play with dice at the tables. At 1 at the Ignite stage. So please join us there. That concludes the session. Here are our contact details in case you want to know more. Once again, we'll be posting some of the links also on the resource website on the conference page. Thank you very much for being here. Thank the panelists and the speakers for their wonderful contributions. Can we have a round of applause for them? And for yourself, please.